Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on top of page 1307. Aleph Shin Zayin. So after the Rebbe Rashab not concluded the whole subject, but concluded a section discussing the transformation of darkness itself, not just that light pierces the dark, but the darkness itself radiates with a special light that comes even more than regular light. He began Ubir Inyan with a whole bunch of questions on a statement in the Zohar that says that Mashiach will come to return Tzaddikim through tshuva, in tshuva. So he asked the questions as follows. I'll just sum up the questions. A series of questions. The l'chera ein muvan. Tshuva is on a chet, on a sin, and tzaddikim have not sinned. So how will we say that they will do tshuva? So yes, it's true indeed that there is a level of tshuva that's not on a sin. Ruach toshav el elikim, when someone wants to get closer to God, in the case of tzaddikim, ava rabba, like he said, b'chol moedecha, and ava b'tainugim, that they pine and they aspire and they yearn to become absorbed in godliness. That's also a form of tshuva, but al pi poshet, when you say tshuva, he says, tshuva is to correct a flaw. And that's indeed the quality that Bal Tshuva have over tzaddikim, that they have much more intensity because they came from the darkness. From distance, they came to closeness. So though it's true that there's the element of tshuva that is not connected to that, but Pashtus tshuva is that, and when you say tzaddikim will also have that, it seems that it means that they will also have that passion. And the question is, how can they have that passion and that intensity when they were not in a distant place? Like he explained, that the greater light that comes from the darkness, the closeness that comes after distance, min ameitza karosika, that when you call from the straits, from the dire straits, from constraints, that's when you get the expansiveness. How is that shaykh? How is that applicable to tzaddikim? So that's the first main question. The distress was the word I wanted to use. Yesterday I was looking for the word distress for Meitzah. Okay. So in other words, he's learning Pshat in Zohar that tshuva is not just the tshuva of Ava b'tainugim, but a tshuva that has that extra energy and more intensity that comes from distance. And how is that shaykh? How is that applicable to tzaddik? Then, as I counted, I think six sub-questions. This is the first. The Gam Tzarech Lahavin. What is the difference? You explain what is the difference then the tzaddik. So fine. However you explain the tshuva of tzaddikim, but what is the difference between the tshuva of Baalei Tshuva? Because the idea of transforming deliberate sins, zdeinus, to tzachiyus, to merits, is again not applicable to tzaddikim, who are don't even relate to the inadvertent sins. That was the second gam tzarech. The gam tzarech lahavin. Tshuva, the quality of tshuva is that the evil is turned into good. Now, we find this also by tzaddikim, and he brought now Perek Tes of Tanya, where their love in the divine soul is so intense and so fills them up that it spills over into the left side of the heart, into the animal, where the animal soul is, that the animal soul, that the pure, the holy waters of mayim, of love, the holy love of the divine soul spills over and also into the negative love of desires of the animal soul, and it transforms it. So based on that, so he's clearly saying that there's that element by tzaddikim. V'im kain, what's the difference between the isapcha? What is the difference between the isapcha of tzaddikim and the isapcha of Baalei Tshuva? So that's a third gam. Then the next one, gam tzarech lahavin. What is the difference between a birur that comes with a er yasher, from a direct light, and one that comes from a refracted light? Both of them cause the entity to become a keli, a container of a receptacle for the divine. So what's the difference? So that's number 4. That's so far the fourth. So question, v'gam, I'm just counting them just to see that I got it right. So that's the third. This is the fourth, is the Ir Yashar. I may be wrong. 1 second, let me just go it over again. I like to know exactly. So the question, what is the difference? Yeah, 2, 3, 4. And now comes one more gam. Another gam, it's known that the mavada is chsadim, comes from chesed, and the mizbada, the thing that is refined, is gvuris, the toyu and tikkun. So toyu is the thing that needs to be repaired. Tikkun is the repair, and that comes from chesed. So then there's different ways that this birur can take place. And to the point that you can have a very powerful light, Ir Yashar, that shines to the point that it transforms. And he gives the example of the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life that sweetened the waters. It didn't just, like he says, it's not just that there's more sweet water than there is bitter water, but it actually sweetened the waters. And yet, that's still not the ultimate transformation, which is when the bitter itself is sweetened in its source, in the source of gvuras. So even though it's sweetened by chsadim, it's not completely until it's also the gvuras themselves get transformed. So tzarich lahavin ma'u inyan, we have to understand, what does that mean, that the gvuras themselves get sweetened in their source, and what is that virtue? What quality does that have over waters that get sweetened through the ches chsadim, through sweet waters? So those are the five so-called questions that he posed in this paragraph that we learned yesterday. 1, the difference, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so now begins the next section where he's going to go into a whole explanation. Actually, this is going to be far more slapshus. Like sometimes I point out that the Rebbe Rashab is very dense and very brief, and we have to work a lot on it. This next section, on the contrary, is going to elaborate at length. It's going to help us understand the whole concept of transforming darkness into light. He's going to explain the whole purpose of why we come to this world. And these are a lot of what he's saying, going to say now, I spelled out on my own, but here the Rebbe Rashab is going to spell it out. And then he's going to go back to understanding all these levels of how you actually bring light into darkness and how you ultimately transform the darkness till the point that the darkness itself shines. That, like we learned till now, which is all coming out, all that's going to be explained with this introduction. So he says, Lahavin Kolzeh, the new paragraph on page 1307. He says, Lahavin Kolzeh, to understand all this, Yesh Lahagdim, one has to preface Mashakosa, what it says in the verse, Ner Hashem Nishma Soda, that the soul of a human being is the lamp, the flame of God. So based on this verse, the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain, therefore, that the neshama is here to be like a flame that illuminates what? A dark state. That's what he's going to explain now. The tachlis briyas ha'adam lamato, the deeper meaning of this verse is that the purpose of the creation of a human being below, hu lahoyer es cheshech the elam ha'tachten, is to illuminate and to radiate the darkness of the lowest world, of the world below, the elam ha'tachten, of the lowest world. Shul cheshech kafla mechupel. It's a world where the cheshech is kafla mechupel. It's double and double. Kafel means double, and mechupel means again double. So in other words, it's a double darkness, a double darkness. What does that mean? That it's dark. Shenira boirak gashmis v'chumrius ha'elam. That when we look in the world, what you see, what's obvious to the naked eye or to the person, to the senses of a human being, what is nira? What do we see? What do we experience? The physical and the crassness of this world. And God and godliness, and the godliness within existence is not at all apparent or revealed at all. So that's a description of this Elam HaTachten. That's not the way it is in Elam Misalyenim, but in Elam HaTachten, this is a description of what the world is like. So the first purpose of creation of a human being, who's the flame of God, the soul is like a flame, is to illuminate this darkness. But he's now going to explain more at length what does this darkness consist of. Because till now, he was just saying we have to transform the darkness itself will be transformed. But now he's going to explain in real practical terms what exactly is this darkness that we're talking about. Tagam deva'ata machayes kulam. And though it says that you sustain everything, you energize everything, in other words, everything in existence comes from godliness, and yet it's concealed. And the Chazal say on this pasuk, don't say machaya, which means to sustain or to give life to, but elam mahava. But more than that, it creates everything. The atam mahava is kulam. You create everything in addition to energizing everything. Shebechol davar, which means in everything in existence, yesh koyach eliki. There's the divine power, hamahava machaya, that creates and sustains or energizes it. That's a fact. And yet, what he's coming to point out, and nevertheless, that's concealed from us. What we see is only the object itself, life itself. We don't see the energy that is within it. But he continues to elaborate. And like a person who feels within himself, a person feels that he's alive, that he's alive, from the energy that gives him life. We all feel it. That's what it means being alive. We feel there's a life force within us. Which means it's not that we are fundamentally alive on our own. But rather, our being alive is due to something that's giving us life. That's why you see, for example, God forbid, after 120 years, the person is no longer alive because the thing that was giving him life is no longer there. So a person feels the life force within us, within themselves. And the same thing, the person sees or perceives that everything in this world is alive. What he means here alive is not only animals and human beings, but he means vegetation and even inanimate, even the mineral. Everything is alive, means that something is giving it existence. I think that's what he means. Makol mokim, nevertheless, even though that's a fact, that we see things are alive, and that means there's a life force within them, Makol mokim, nevertheless, however, we don't sense or perceive and feel by the person, he doesn't feel and see or sense or feel that this chayis is godliness. You can call it electricity. You can call it nature. He doesn't feel that it's alikus. So in other words, even though it's clear that there's a life force within existence, but the alikus of it, the divinity of it, is concealed. And why is that the case? He says. So he's actually dissecting the anatomy of this world. And that's due to the fact because there's a certain natural order, the natural behavior, the natural laws of existence that the world functions according to a certain set of laws. The sun rises, the sun sets, everything that goes through the seasons. Every part of existence has its so-called program. And though it's clear that there's an energy force within it, but you don't see that it's a divine, every second God is choosing to create it. Rather, you just see the process, you see like a clock is turning. The b'chol yom hashemesh zereach b'mizrach. Every day the sun rises in the east, v'shekeya b'mayriv, and it sets in the west. V'chol inyonei elam misnagim al pi hateva tomid be'efen echad. And all matters of this world, all the affairs of this world, behave according to the nature consistently in one particular way. It doesn't waver. It doesn't like one day the sun doesn't rise or it rises not in the east. It's all like a clockwork, a certain program that just functions with a particular set and unwavering routine. So what does that do? Hine, as a result of that, mistalim halakush einanid v'nigla. So we don't see that there's a will, a driving force of godliness that is directing all of this. Because the way the Eibishter created the world, he put it into these laws of nature, that one can look at nature and not come away understanding that there's a force called godliness. They could just come away with saying, you know what, there's a program here. We can extrapolate with our seichel, we can come to understand it. But on an obvious level, you can just say, this is nature. This is the way the world works. As you see millions and not billions of people say that. Some even deny and say, we don't need a God. Just shows you that, why is it possible to say that? Because it's not obvious. Now, if it was obvious, you'd see God, for example, moving the sun every morning, or the other laws of nature, you'd see the engineer actually behind the scenes, we'd see how he's controlling the whole world. That's a different story, but we don't see that. We don't see behind the curtain. For us, what we see is the product, and the product is a set in motion series of events, routines, what we call the laws of nature or the order of nature, the natural order. So alakus einanid v'nigla. The kashanasa, and he's now continuing to explain. The kashanasa, they say below, it should say eze hischachus, not eine. Because when there's some type of hischachus, something new happens, something novel happens, meaning not natural, kamoy ba'osis u'moivsim, shein l'mayla meteva, when we see that, for example, osis u'moivsim, signs and wonders, miracles basically, shein l'mayla meteva, which are higher than nature, or they suspend or transcend nature. Shateva is battle. Nature gets suspended. Nature gets pauses. In that you see a gilei elikus. So, for instance, when the Jews were walking through, when the water of Kriyas Yamsuf parted, the waters parted, and they were able to walk through the sea, like walking on land, that was clearly something, a divine hand, because naturally water does not part, does not stand. You can't walk through water. So that tells you that when you don't have the miracle, you don't see the divine. It's only when there's some type of suspension or shattering of the laws of nature, that's when you see something novel. But if it's not novel, then we go back to the regular order of things. So even though the same God that creates a miracle is the one that creates nature, but nature conceals its creator. Ukamoi kain, and so too, gamba anisim shal pi hateva. Also with the miracles that are not manifest in nature. Nid b'zeh gam kain gilei elikus. So we know there's another form of miracle that doesn't suspend nature, but it's within nature. For example, the miracle of Purim. So though you don't see something unnatural, but when you look at the series of events and the sequence of events, and you look in retrospect, you see that there's a hand here that caused all these things to happen together, Vashti being killed, Esther becoming the queen, Mordechai overhearing the plot over a period of years. So he says, so also nisim al pi hateva, that are not shattering nature, but are work within the laws of nature. In that too, you can see a gilei elikus. Obviously, it takes a little more effort to see it because you have to contemplate on it, but you can see something happen here. Whereas in actual nature, where there's none of that, you don't see a result that is miraculous. You don't see it, as you'll call back to in a moment. That all the dwellers of the land, everyone on earth, saw Yeshua Salakenu, God, the divine salvation, how God saved. But this is all nisim, either actual miracles that suspend nature or miracles that are within nature. But when things are behaving all according to nature and you don't see any particular special outcome, so then the godliness is not apparent and revealed within this nature. So all this is coming to elaborate why this world is called a dark world, because the divine that sustains and energizes it and creates it is concealed. And what we see is the physical and the crassness of this, and the coarseness of this material world. But then the Rebbe Rashab qualifies, and even though Sheba Emes, and even though that in truth, Hariyateva Gufu Elikus, the very nature itself, not only if it leads to a miraculous result or something extraordinary, something different, something novel, but nature itself is Elikus. Hateva begimatri Elikim. Hateva, the very word, the nature, Hateva, is the same gematria as Elikim, 86. Elikim, obviously, you write it with a hey. So that means that is Elikim. The zrichas v'shkias hashemesh, because this rising and the setting of the sun, v'chein sivuv kol hagalgalim, and the same thing with the orbit and the orbit of all the spheres. According to Torah, there's the galgalim, the 9 different galgalim that are the different atmospheres that are spheres. Their movement, all the movement of the celestial bodies, essentially, the hiluch kol inyana elam, and the patterns or the routines or the movement of all matters, affairs of this world. Everything has its progression. Everything has its journey, so to speak, its movement. Humelakus. It's all coming from godliness. So that's the truth. And he goes even further. And the same is true with the light of the sun. That radiates the earth and to those that dwell in it. So not just the movement of the sun, its rising and setting, but the very fact that it illuminates this world is also b'koyach eliki. It's also a divine power. What is cheres? I think he's using an example. Cheres is usually one second. I'm just trying to look it up. 1 second. Cheres is usually a clay cheres, like a clay vessel. I don't think it means that here. Like earthenware. I think what it's referring to, if you say to a piece of a vessel made out of earth, of clay or earth, that it should shine, it's not going to shine. Only God makes a sun shine. The sun doesn't have any power of its own. It's only because of God that it says it. She says, the Mashashemesh Meir Er Makadosh Baruch Hu Imer Lecheres B'Yizra. He's taking an object called the sun, which is really an inanimate entity on its own, and telling it, I'm giving the power to shine and illuminate the world. So what do you see?
In Eir, Ha'Imer Lecheres B'Yizra, U'Vat Rechavim Yachtiv.
Okay. So this is a famous Chacham Tzvi that Chassidus brings. It says in the Tshuva Chacham Tzvi, in the Simin Yud Ches, section 18, that the behavior of nature, the natural order, the Keirezen, the Chacham Tzvi calls that B'Shem Teva Klolis, general nature. That's what he calls it. Hi Elokus. That is godliness. That's the fact. That's the truth. Shalzeh Omer David HaMelech Olav HaShalom, Hamachas Shamayim Ba'avim, Hamechin La'aretz Motor. And this is what David HaMelech says, that God is the one that covers the heaven with clouds and prepares the Aretz Motor, and prepares rain for the earth. In other words, there's no power of its own. It's all coming from a force, a divine force that's causing it to be that way. Who prepares the rain? It's not the clouds in the sky. It's not the sky. It's the Eibishter is preparing the rain. He's the one that Mesavev Hasiba, that causes this process. And the clouds that God creates is the way that he uses. That's from the details of the natural order that God is using. In other words, he is the engineer that's using these tools, these instruments, to achieve what he wants to achieve. But it's not the clouds themselves and not the sun itself that has power. It's the divine force within it that gives it the power. So the very clouds themselves is a protei ateva. This is similar to what Razal say. The sages say, Shlishis. He talks about what does God do the first 3 hours, the next 3 hours, the next 3 hours. We learned this, that the first 3 hours, so he says, Shlishis Yeshev V'zon, in the third hour, in the Shlishis, in the third period rather, what is the able to do? He sits and zon and nourishes. Shamezenis Asmon Zewa Teva Pratis. The food that we receive, whatever food that is coming from the food, but what's behind the scenes, that's the Teva HaPratis. That's what he meant, Teva Klolis. The Teva Klolis is a lakus, and then the Teva Pratis is how God, how he does it, how he runs it. It's like saying, for example, let's say an engineer built a machine. The machine is just the engineer's ingenuity, the way he implements what he wants to get done. But it's not the machine that does it. It's the engineer that built this machine and that's working through this machine. So the Eibishter Zonim Afanis, he sustains and nourishes, a Yeshiv Zon rather, that the Mezenas themselves, that's a specific nature, like the clouds when it comes to rain. The Hazon Eina Hamazon. But who's the one that's actually sustaining and feeding and nourishing us? It's not the food itself. But rather it's God who prepares this mazon. He's the one that makes it available and creates it. If you didn't have that...
The Rashi is explaining, the Shemesh is called Cheres.
I just said that, yeah. It's inanimate on its own. It doesn't have anything without God saying so. Okay. V'hainu shemesavev umanig be'efen kazeh sheyisavev v'yih hamazon. In other words, what we actually see is the food, and we're being sustained by the food. But the Eibishter is the one that is like I don't want to say puppeteer, but the one that is causing, that is behind the scenes, is mesavev. He's maneuvering, umanig, and governs in such a manner that this food should be created, that this food should be created and be available to us. So this is all the truth. But he's going to come back and soon say it's true, but we don't see it. But he continues elaborating even more how nature is really godliness. And in this we indeed see the divine power and divine providence. What does that pasuk mean? Chelka achas timter, timter, or timter, timoter. I mean, I assume it means that the Eibishter is the one that is causing it to rain. So even the Hanogas HaTeva, not just Nisim, miracles, and not only miracles within nature, but nature itself and its governance and the natural order is all Elikus. And I see the Rebbe Rashab is continuing to elaborate before he goes back. Remember, all this is coming to lead us to explain how this is a dark world. But right now, he went and said, remember the truth, however, going back to the words, he says, Ima Yesha be'emes. So all this is a Ima Yes. And even though in truth, it's all godliness, and that's what he's elaborating, he's soon going to come to conclude that even though it's really godliness, but it's concealed. But he continues.
This is in Sefer Omis, Chelko Achas Timotel. The Eibishter said, Onoichi manati mekemes hageshem, והמטרתי על עיר אחס, ועל עיר אחס לא יאמתיר, חלקו אחס תימותר, וחלקו, that the Eibishter is controlling where the rain should go.
Right, I understand. One part is Timothy should go toward rain. I got it. He designates Chelka Achas Timothy, yeah. Ube'emes, to continue, and in truth, Hanhoget Tmidius, Habilti Mishtanis, this consistent and unwavering behavior, which Habilti Mishtanis, which is unwavering, it doesn't change. That's what we said before, that nature in its unchanging element can delude us into thinking there's nothing going on, but there's not godliness. It's just the clock of nature, it's the program. He says, but the truth is that this consistency, like the movement and the orbit of the spheres, of the celestial bodies, that when you contemplate, you can see in it. I know the Rebbe Rashab didn't use the word contemplate, but that's what he's referring to. You can see in it koyach ein sof. Because what would give a simple mortal, if you saw a stone flying in the sky and it doesn't stop flying, what would you say? That there must be a power of Ein Sof that's keeping it flying, because a stone at some point has to fall. So when you see the celestial bodies continue in their movement, unwavering and never shifting and never changing, that reveals to us the Koyach Ein Sof. That's the truth. Because everything that is mortal or everything that is finite has to change. Finite things are temporary. The year by hefsek, it has to change, and there has to be a point where it pauses, where it stops, where it ceases. And therefore, when you see that it's not that way, that it's consistent and it's not changing, how does it koyach ein sof? That tells you there's a koyach ein sof. As was written earlier at length in the Maimer Leman Das, and they say below, that was in volume 2, page 684 and on. But now, okay, if that's the case, so why do we call this a dark world? So the Rebbe Rashab now goes, this is all imayes. This is all the truth. Ach kol zeh, however, all this that we just said, that is God that is running the show. That is Hashgacha Pratis, that God is the one that feeds and sustains. That God is the one that causes it to rain. That God is the one that causes the sun to shine and the very movement of all the celestial bodies and everything else in nature in this world. Ach kol zeh, all this, however, is Lamisha Ma'ayin U'Maimik B'zeh. This is someone who delves into it and immerses themselves into it In other words, you need to concentrate and need to contemplate on this. This doesn't come automatic. Aval bestam. But when a person is just bestam, meaning he's not making any effort, just in other words, the natural reaction when you look at the world, the divine is not apparent and revealed at all. It's when you're ma'ayin and maimik b'zeh, but not when you don't. When you don't, you can easily get lulled into thinking, it's just running on its own. Why is that the case? So now he's coming back to the darkness. The zehu, why is that the case? It seems strange. If it's obvious, then nothing can really be permanent unless a driving Ein Sof force is causing it to be that way. And nothing just drives on its own. No one would say, for instance, that if someone delivers you food, that the food is delivering itself. Someone gave it to you. Nevertheless, why is it possible? Because God did something very strange. He changed something. He concealed his hand. And that's because the divine energy behind all the scenes is very much misalam me'id. It became very much concealed. When you read this, you actually can feel how the truth is one way, but then what happens if the engineer, if the creator is deliberately choosing to conceal and let us not see his hand, his invisible hand? Misalam me'id. Shezeh inyan teva meloshu tovu b'yamsuf. So one of the meanings of teva is from the word tovu, submerged, b'yamsuf. When you throw an object into the water, you say tovu b'yamsuf. It sank into the water. It's submerged in the water. Sha'era leki mudfa b'ribay halamas. Why is teva called that? Because teva is exactly that. The divine energy is submerged and concealed. It's like when you throw an object in water, you don't see the object. The water covers over. Teva is exactly that. That the divine energy that is sustaining it, that is really the essence of nature, is mutva, is submerged, is buried, is sunk in. B'ribui halamas, in a multitude, in a large number of many concealments. That's why it's called teva. V'hainu, and this means mipnei b'chinas simtzum amiyah ta'er. This is due to the tzimtzum, the tzimtzum, the concealment and miut and diminishment of the divine energy of the earth, b'ribui hishtalshlus, in a number of gradations and progressions, meaning concealment after concealment. As was explained earlier, this is the Torah of the Magid, that Ayin Beis right now, all these hundreds of pages is around as a parenthesis in. So in volume 2, this was explained at length. And the Rebbe Rashab has referred to this line a number of times. At least I remember at least 4 or 5 times, that the Eibishter Mei created a number of tzimtzumim, of concealments, and derech kama elamis, which travel through a number of worlds. And he explained what's the difference between tzimtzumim and worlds. Bottom line is that it's concealment after concealment that hides and conceals the divine energy in nature. And that's why we don't see it without effort, unless there's ma'ayin umaymik, like he says. If you delve into it, if you immerse yourself and you concentrate, your focus is one thing. But minastam, like he says, aval bestam, if you don't do that, it's the divine energy that is the essence of all of nature and of all of everything is concealed within it. Okay. So it's pretty clear. This piece, as I said, is elaborate, but I'll continue. Let me continue reading on top of page 1308. Let's turn the page. And I'll stop, maybe I'll stop at the end of the paragraph because it's going pretty smooth. And then if anybody has any questions. So this is in general the picture. The Rebbe Rashab gave us an elaborate, relatively elaborate picture, which you don't see so often in Maimorim at such elaboration, of what it means that he didn't yet get to the Tachlis Adam. The person comes to illuminate it and reveal the divine. But right now he's talking about that the world is a darkest place in general. Of Befrat, he says now, on top of 1308, this is true in the general existence. And specifically, in order for there to be the creation of the lowest worlds, the beginning yesh, not just that it conceals, it's a state of yesh that the world itself, its creations sense their own ego, it sends their own self, as self, their own consciousness. So till now, he wasn't even focusing on the yesh, that we have an ego, we have self-interest, we have our own self-contained consciousness. Here, till now, he was talking about just existence by its nature. Nature itself conceals the divine, but especially if you're talking about that there should be a level of yesh, so that needs to have more number of miyutim, diminishments. Again, a progressive diminishments to the extent to the extent that the energy, the divine energy, should be concealed to the point that it can be a mocker for a yesh, which is the opposite of elikus, because elikus is ein eid milvadei, God is everything. Like he says also, he says it essentially in Tanya, in Perek Vov, which I just finished teaching. He says that everything that the Gedush, everything that's bottled to elikus is Gedush. Because Gedusha means it recognizes the divine. In order for there to be Sitra Achre, which doesn't feel bittul, so the energy has to go through a lot of diminishments, to the point that the energy is like giving it Bechinas Acharayim, it's like giving it throwing it over your back. You're not looking in the face of when you love someone, there's a connection, you look at them and you gave them a gift. But if you're giving them a very diminished form, because they don't sense that they're connected to you, it's a self-independent consciousness, that has to go through much more kama miyutim, to the point there should be a mokrli yesh. U'kamoshn is barely ill, as was explained earlier, dibra maskul ve'ela shmeis. Again, he refers us to volume 2, page 815. V'hisavus, v'hahisavus, and the creation ibchinas helam v'hester habayra ma'anivra. The very creation is in a form of a concealment and a covering of the creator from the creation. U'biyeser, and increasingly so, b'hisavus elam atach. That's even true in higher worlds. There's a concealment. Even in Bria, Yetzirah, and Asir Ruchnis, there's a concealment. However, it's not to the extent, but increasingly so, even more so, in the creation of this lowest of worlds, where there's a concealment and a covering of the divine energy in an increased fashion. So in the concealment, there's levels. You could have a concealment of the divine, but it's not completely concealed. In this lowest world, it's the most concealed in an increased way. Va'ikerhu, he mentioned yesh, now he's going to go to klippus and sitra achre. Va'ikerhu, and the primary concealment is mahalomis v'asterim shemetzada klippus v'sitra achre. And the primary concealments and coverings is due to the klippus and the sitra achre, which is a force, as I said before, that is the other side that conceals and denies or avoids and ignores godliness. Because prior to the eating the sin of the tree of knowledge, and nevertheless it was a world, but elikus was nida, it was apparent, godliness. And all the creations sensed a certain sublimation, a certain sense of surrender or subjugation to godliness. I think Medrash Tanchuma, unless it's Medrash Tehillim. Maybe Medrash Tehillim. Not sure. Al Pasuk Boy v'nishtachavu, which says that Adam Arishan said, "Come and let's prostrate ourselves. Let's bow to God." Amalem, the Medrash says, Amalem Adam Arishan, Ani ve'atem bo v'nishtachavu v'nichra. I and you should come. Let's gather together and come and bow, prostrate ourselves, and bow and prostrate ourselves before God. That means there was a recognition that there's a godliness in the world. He's giving now an example, like even the chamer, the donkey of Rav Pinchas ben Yair, so you behemoths, b'harei elef shekoydem achet, v'lo ochel she'enem u'usar. So we know that by Rav Pinchas ben Yair, even his animal, his donkey, did not eat food that Meiser was not taken from it. An animal, you give it food, it just eats indiscriminately. But the Chamera, Rav Pinchas ben Yair, the Gemara says, would not eat from food if you didn't take Meiser from it. Why? Because it was rooted from the behemoths, Baharei Elef. There's an expression, the behemoths that are rooted in the thousand mountains from Koydem Hachet. It refers to a level that precedes Chet Tzadas. So Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair's donkey came from the world of before Chet Tzadas, so it sensed something that was not divine. And therefore, it did not eat something that was not Meiser, wasn't taken from it. Why is that the case? That was due to the refinement even of the crass world, even the material world was more refined before Chet Tzadas. And the revelation of the divine, both the world was not as crass, was more refined, and the divine revelation that this chamer, that this donkey felt, and it felt as gil elikus, and it felt that this food is Meiser wasn't taken from it, therefore it wouldn't eat it. This is even true as an animal, and for sure the person because, and for sure a human being who is even more refined, who's more. That by him there's the zichur chachumrius before the eitz hadas, the refinement of the cross world, and the revelation of light that the divine was apparent and revealed. And what changed? That's before chet hadas. After they ate from the tree of knowledge, but that caused that the chumrius, the material crass world, should become far more crass and coarse. With a mixture of the negative, of the evil against God. Like it says elsewhere, and from this comes the intense and the great darkness and the increased concealment. So the Rebbe Rashab now explained in general what the concealment is, when it came, and of course the lower the world, and especially after the Chet Tzadas, is when it really became most dominant. Before Chet Tzadas, it was still not quite as intense, like he said before. So the Klippas and Sitra Achre began to dominate after the Chet Tzadas.
Because of the Taurus.
Because of the sin. Once they ate from the tree of knowledge, which they were told not to, they basically caused the divine to be concealed and caused the world to become more so-called more separate and not aligned to godliness. Yeah.
What happened? Koidem they existed, but they had no power with the tree. They were bottled. The
Shalosh says it was Klippa Shemer Lepri. Before the Chet Tzadas, the Klippa knew and recognized that it was a shell to protect the fruit. But once Adam and Chava ate from the tree, they gave power to the Klippa to be an end in itself. Imagine worshiping a potato peel or an eggshell or an orange peel, not recognizing that all it is really there to protect the fruit. So the material world became so-called an end in itself, a self-consciousness that entered, whereas before that, that's why Adam and Chava were not ashamed, because their sexuality was godly. Why should they be ashamed? Once they became self-conscious, they recognized, and that's why Hashem said to Adam, Ayeko, where are you? I don't recognize you. It's someone who was following the guidelines that the Eibishter gave him, And then when you start wavering went off, something changes. The Tzelem Elokim went into concealment. Anyway, bottom line is that this is the world of darkness. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to let me one second. Let me finish, and then we're going to stop for questions. 1 second. And after we're going to finish this part, I'm going to stop for questions. But the next paragraph is going to go back and say, and that's why a human being was created, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, which he said before, a flame, in order to illuminate and bring back and reveal the godliness that became concealed in this world. That's the flow here. And after he elaborates on this darkness and the work we do, he's going to then talk about the different levels of how you illuminate darkness to the point that even darkness itself can be transformed, as we learned previously, before he started Lahavin Kol Zeh. But let me stop here since we learned this whole piece about darkness, if anybody wants to ask anything. No questions? Okay. If there's no questions, I'll read on. I'll continue. I guess this is the easiest part of Ayin Beis, because everybody understands what darkness means. You know, this doesn't need a lot of elaboration. You just look around and we see that we don't see godliness easily. Yeah. But what's interesting here is how the Rebbe Rashab understands that the truth is that's not the case. It's just that we are, the divine concealed itself. So let's continue. Valzehu briyas adam lamata. And this is the purpose of the creation of the person below. Why we said, why a human being, like he said, tachlis briyas adam lamata. Come down below, lohayir esacheshach, to illuminate and radiate and illuminate the darkness. Through how? How do you illuminate this darkness that conceals the divine in nature and all the levels, everything we spoke about? He does that by revealing the light of the divine soul below. So we have a divine soul that is like the flame of God, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. And when you allow that to shine, that brings a light into this dark world. So we don't come unarmed. We come into this world, even though we ourselves are also part of the concealment, and we too can not see, but we have a divine soul, and by his galus, we radiate and illuminate the darkness, and that's the purpose of why we're here. Because the divine soul, nislabish benefesh abamis, it encloses itself, it gets dressed up, it's enclosed within the animal soul. In other words, the Eibishter didn't just make that you have a divine soul here and the animal soul there. They come together. The nefesh alikis manifests itself in the nefesh abamis. It's literally like a person dressing itself in a garment of the nefesh abamis. It's not just like passing through. It's not just as a side thing. It's actually completely enclosed. And tfisa mamish, it's contained there, it's held there. Literally, like we say, when a neshama comes into a body, the neshama and the body become so inseparable, you can't even distinguish. You can't say, which part of my finger is the finger and which part is the life force. The life force is so permeates, literally like electricity that completely is using the appliance, is now alive. A light bulb is shining, even though they are two entities. So it's an establishment prisa mamish by nefesh abamis. The behis gabrus hachum is the nefesh abamis misalma the nefesh alikis, to the point that when the crassness of the animal soul gets intensified, it has the power to conceal the energy and the light of the divine soul. That's our point. The divine soul, in other words, is like in a golus in the animal soul. That's what he says in Tanya, a number of places, that when you follow the animal soul, it's not just the animal soul, you're also schlepping the nefesh alikis. Because if a person sins or transgresses or does something that defies what God wants, the nefesh elokis is also part of it. It's not what it wants to do, but the animal soul has the ability to drag with it the divine soul that's part of its experience. That would not have been possible if the divine soul remains removed. That's due to the fact that the divine soul is in a form of islapshus. It's just like if you dress yourself in dirty garments, your body is going to get dirty because the garments affect you. So the due to islapshus and tfisa. Tfisa means that you're like contained by it. You're controlled. The tfisa means that's not, loy nitfas means that you're there, like the sunlight that shines on a pile of garbage is not nitfas in it. It shines on everything equally. It's more makif. But there are things that are, tfisa means it's like an apnimius. It's contained there. So because of the islapshus with tfisa shlei ba nefesh abamis, the divine soul in the animal soul, the faculties of the divine soul get diminished and concealed in clothing, in this dress, as it gets dressed up in the animal soul. Commission is bodily ill, as was explained earlier. In the beginning of the Hemshech of Ayin Beis, where did he say that in the beginning? Or maybe by Erd and Keli in the first Maimer. And become a duchtin or kamedrushim means and a number of other discourses throughout this Hemshech. Valkain, and that's why, because the divine soul is so tied up, so to speak, it's so engaged with the animal soul. Valkain bis gabrus hachumrius. That's why when the crassness or the coarseness of the animal soul becomes intensified, misalmim hakeiches da nefesh elokis. The faculties of divine soul, which are purely divine, like he explains in Tanya chapter 3, the faculties are all about thinking, contemplating, chachma bina das and midas of love and awe and reverence of God. They become concealed. And this is in a state of the darkness is intensified in the person and in the world. However, the purpose is, now he's going to go back to ukashem megala nafshei elokis. However, when a person then goes ahead and reveals the light of his divine soul, ba'aveda b'tfilah, in his service in davening, in prayer, b'seirus ava v'yira, in awakening and stimulating and arousing his love and reverence, haboy de asoga v'avona, that comes from comprehension and understanding. In other words, he's not just letting himself be dragged along with the animal soul. He makes an exerted effort to contemplate on godliness, and that awakens a love and a reverence of God. Hu kashem is beinin, eich shekol davar shebe'elam. And that means he's not being complacent, like he said, stam, like he said before. He's not doing it. He's actually exerting himself. He's playing a very concerted effort. Kashem is beinin. He contemplates, eich shekol davar shebe'elam, that everything in this world, Nivra was created, v'chai, and is sustained and energized, v'koyach eliki, from a divine energy, hamahava mechayes, that creates and energizes it. Ta'gam shekol achadechem Yisrael maimen ba'amunah shlema, b'chidush ha'elam. It's not enough, even though every Jew believes with complete faith in the chidush ha'elam, meaning that the world did not create itself, but God created the world, that the world is a creation. That's not a Gilead. That's just an Amunah. The Ima Amunah, Yochel Liyas, V'kol Mokem is Gabes HaCheshach. Because even with the faith, you still see there could be an intensification of darkness. Like you see the Ganav, before he goes to steal, he calls out to God, he prays to God to succeed. How's that possible? Even though he believes in God and his ability and his divine and his providence, And nevertheless, he's behaving and being, he's defying God completely. He's going to steal. So that's why Amunah alone is not enough. There has to be an intellectual, a cognitive comprehension. In compelling case that is made, in a convincing case, that you must say so. It's not just a faith. And a contemplation how nothing creates itself. And when you see existing entity, your seichel, not just your amunah, your intelligence tells you something had to put it here. Something had to create it. It didn't come on its own. Because to say that a yesh came from another yesh, that a tree came from a seed, from another tree, forever, is sheker muchad, is absolute false. Like the Rambam writes in his Guide for the Perplexed, in his introductions. I'm not sure where to stop because it's all like one flow here. Let me just go a few more lines. So the contemplation is a very intelligent one, that he contemplates, that when you see an existing entity, you have to say that it once did not exist. Kodma means it was preceded by not being first. It was first not there before it became there. And it was created from a state where it didn't exist to a state of existence. You know what? 1 second. I will stop here. He's going to continue on this contemplation all the way to lead us back to say that this is all the process of how the divine soul begins to retaliate, so to speak, against the darkness. It comes out swinging and is going to bring light of Elikus in a dark world. Till now, he was talking about the darkness of the world, and even the Nefesh Elikiz comes and can be concealed by the animal soul. But when a person makes an exerted effort and a concerted effort to change that through contemplation and through Ava V'yira that we're talking about now, that changes and it reveals godliness in this dark world and in the darkness within the person. That's what he's going to be saying. But I see it's going to be a little more elaborate, so I'll stop here, and we'll go over it again. But this is essentially the point being made. So we covered some ground today. As I said, this is a lot easier reading and explaining, frankly, than when things are more dense and a little more concentrated. But let me stop I'm going to stop here close to halfway down, a little more than halfway down, page 1308. Any questions?
What did he say before in the page before? Hamugbol behechech sheishtane v'yeh boi hefsek.
Yeah. So I explained it. Everything that is finite doesn't have infinite energy. Simple as that. If it's a finite entity, it doesn't have infinite energy. It has to stop at some point. Everything that is born and it dies. Everything deteriorates, erodes, perishes. So if you see a stone in the sky, I said, and it keeps flying, you have to say there's some type of power that's keeping it that way. Because if you throw a stone, as far as you can throw it, it's going to fall at some point. There's nothing in this world that has infinite power, because finite is not infinite. That's what he says. So if you see somebody lives forever, you know that something is giving it that energy. That's the koyach ein sof. It's similar to what he just said, that yesh miyesh can't go forever back because everything is mugbal. From gvul, you can't get to bli gvul. Okay?
And Chamoire Shal Brichas Ben Yair was like before the Chet?
That's what he says. Mebehemis mahalei elef shekayde machet.
What's a concept? Behemis Bahalei Olef?
It's a level of the behemoths in the Markova, that the behemoth lamata was margish, sensed something in the I have to look up the details, but it's something like that. The behemoth out of the Aleph is a level of the Sherish HaBehemoth, like in the Pnei Sherish HaBemerkava, I think. So the behemoth, the Chamer down below, sensed its makir, and that's which was like Kedem Chet, and that's why it would not eat food that's not mu'usr. Yeah. That's why it says, Anu im reshenim kamalochim anu kumnei adam, im anu kumnei adam, im reshenim kumnei adam anu kechamer shel Pinchas ben Yair, right? Okay, so we're going to